My name is Mikoski, and I am a Presbyterian minister who served a fairly large church in the suburb of Detroit, specializing in educational ministry for most of the 1990s, and then went back to school and worked on a degree, a PhD in practical theology at Emory University, and then I ended up being called back to where I'd done seminary, which is Princeton Seminary, so it was a little bit like welcome back home. Some of my teachers were my colleagues. Most of them have retired now. I've been there for 12 years, and I teach in the area of education as well as practical theology more broadly. Today, in our time together, we're going to talk some. We're not going to be exhaustive. First, I just want to say that as a disclaimer, there is a lot to say about the brain and learning, and it continues to unfold, and some things that seem to have been key brain insights now turns out to have been fads. And so we're just going to talk about some of what we know about learning as a result of neuroscience and insights into the brain. I have raised this issue about learning, that is, with the steering committee of the confirmation project on a regular basis, because we're doing great work in empirical research, both qualitative and quantitative, but not everything that we want to make available will come just from surveys and case studies. We also need to take into account certain theological reflections and issues, but also the fact that we now live in the digital age. And I'm looking around, I don't see too many digital natives here. Most of us are digital immigrants, but most of the people we're teaching are digital natives. I even have this in my own family. I have 3 kids. 2 are in college, one's an 8th grader. The 2 who are in college, they use the internet a lot and digital media, social media, but not in the same way as my 8th grader, who's never known a time without having an internet connection. So we need to take into account something about the digital age and what does it mean to, I think, probably develop hybrid approaches to pedagogy and confirmation with regard to social media. Okay, to start, we're going to start with something about the brain and a little bit about brain architecture and how it works. And again, this is just really the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more and so far beyond what I can comprehend. I mean, you really have to have advanced knowledge in chemistry and anatomy and so on. But nevertheless, I'm going to talk as a practical theologian, harvesting the work of others. And so we'll get into some of that, and then we'll talk about what might this mean for confirmation. And I have a few thoughts, but I am as interested in your thoughts as hearing myself talk about that subject, because I think it's an open question. And we cannot just do the same old anymore, partly because I know that's true, because a lot of people have asked me when they know I'm a professor of Christian education, they say, what can we do about confirmation? And almost always the question is, can you tell me the magic curriculum that will solve our confirmation course? And I hope, if nothing else, you take away today the idea that curriculum is only one piece of the issue. It's actually a much bigger thing to think about confirmation and to address what's not working. Part of it has to do with how we think about learning. Okay, so I want you now to take just a second. I have, by the way, if you like brain stuff, you can get this app on your computer for $2.99. And it's this nice 3D kind of thing. You can spin around. You can also hit a button and you get the main lobes in the cortex. It doesn't go into the other inner structure of the brain, but still it's kind of interesting. Actually, the best app is for iPhones and iPads, which it does go in. You can see 3D stuff. Yeah, Lisa has it too. It's really great. I think it's probably $3 or something. And that one also gives you fMRI images, so you can start at the top of the brain and work your way through. You can also go side to side and see what's in there. It's really pretty fascinating.
What's it called?
Well, this one is called 3D Brain. And I can't remember, Lisa maybe.
I have it on my iPad, which will be really good.
Okay, she can look at it. I can't remember. But if you go to the App Store and you type in brain, you'll find one you to write down for just 1 minute, when you see the image of the brain that's now in front of you, what do you know about the brain and learning? Okay, I mean, it could be from this or just anything you've picked up along the way. Just write down what you know about already about brain and learning. Take 1 minute. Okay, about 10 more seconds. Okay, now turn to one person next to you and compare your notes.
No, the brain back.
About 30 seconds. Or 3 seconds. Okay. What were some of the things that came up in your conversations?
Brains are plastic.
All right, brains are plasticity. We'll get into that. Okay, that's a key thing. That's actually a relatively new idea in the sense that neuroscience has been able to parse out how that actually happens. What else?
Required blood flow.
It requires your blood flow, correct? Yeah, there's an image out, but there's all kinds of vessels and stuff. Actually, that's one of the ways that people, neuroscientists began to figure out what's going on in brain functioning was by tracking blood flow. Put all kinds of sensors and so on, and then you can check the different rates. What really advanced neuroscience, and still is advancing neuroscience, is a step beyond checking blood flow, which is MRI, functional fMRI. So you can see blood flow, but you can actually see sort of slices of what's going on. And you can see the whole brain and where the electrical activities, not just the blood flow. But some of the other, so there's about 4 different devices or tools that are used to non-invasively check what's going on. But fMRI is the big one. But it started with blood flow.
Maybe this is one that's been debunked, but the left brain and right brain function differently?
Yes, that was, it's a fad that's kind of true, not very true. A lot less true than people thought it was like in the 1980s and 90s. Like you're a right brain person or a left brain person. Turns out that's not actually true. There is some hemispheric specialization, but much more for any kind of function, the brain uses both sides and integrates it. And I'll get into this, but there's another way in which that right brain, left brain stuff has been somewhat debunked, even though it's true that there are certain kinds of characteristics. But what popular media and what educators did with that when it first came out was to push it too far. Same thing is true of mirror neurons. That's like one of the most recent fads. That's sort of true, but also not in the way that it's been taken hold of by educators particularly, but also the popular media. I mean, neuroscientists just go crazy when they see what people do with some of this stuff. They simplify and then get it wrong.
The prefrontal cortex, right, lobe is, takes a long time to develop. The part of that's logic and planning and thinking things through isn't until much later than we thought, like into the 20s or something.
24, 25. Yeah, we'll talk about that in there a little bit. Okay. So, and you know, more will come up as I lift up certain things. You'll say, oh, anything about that, or some stuff I hope will be, like, oh, I didn't know about that. There's a whole lot more that we'll all learn, I think, in the next several years, because this is the new frontier. We went to the moon, you know, we went to the West Coast, and then we went to the moon, and Americans always did frontier. The frontier now really is the brain. And what neuroscientists are figuring out is that the brain is incredibly complex. You know, when you see pictures of the Hubble telescope and they show you one little square of the sky and you look up close and each of those little things is a galaxy with thousands of stars, that's what the brain is like, in the sense that there's 100 billion, if not 100, I can't remember if it's 100 billion, 100 trillion neurons in the brain. You could take everything that's ever been on film and television since the beginning, and including right now, all of it can be stored in each of our brains and still not run out of space. So there's like an unbelievable amount of storage capacity in there. A little bit of background to thinking about the brain and neuroscience. There are also conversations that have gone on in philosophy that are really helpful. For example, and I know I'm with a bunch of Lutherans, so Immanuel Kant, a good Lutheran philosopher, Lutheran-ish, although he's talking about sort of law and gospel, freedom and determinism and stuff, but he, in his crucial book, The Critique of Pure Reasoning, which hardly anybody reads unless they have to, and then they want to cry, says that the mind is not passive. It is an active process. It's an active combinatory process. And I have here not only one of his images, but one of his famous statements: thoughts without content are empty, and intuitions without concepts are blind. Meaning, in other words, raw aesthetic data is combined with logical categories. All of this is in the hardwiring of the brain, the capacities for this, and we actively construct ideas and thoughts through the imagination. Yeah, so he said that in the late 18th century, and we're still trying to catch up to that pedagogically. That learners have to actively construct knowledge, because this is resonant with the way the mind works. It's an active process. I'm skipping over Hegel, another German-ish philosopher. It's not, neither one of these guys are Japanese Orthodox, but they're heavily influenced by that. But those two German thinkers had a huge influence on American thought and American pragmatism, particularly with two thinkers who have a lot to do with psychology, education, and the brain. And that's, first of all, William James from Harvard, who is the founder of American psychology. And he says something that has a very contemporary ring to it. Action seems to follow feeling, but really, action and feeling go together. And by regulating the action, which is under the more direct control of the will, we can indirectly regulate the feeling, which is not. What he's kind of getting after there is there's more interplay between than what you might think. And people want to talk about separating out action, will, and thought. Or one of the more common ways to separate things out is head and heart. It turns out neuroscience says that is a false kind of dichotomy. And William James, as a pragmatist philosopher, adds action into that, about how we respond and so on. That we have to think about these these things as interconnected systems, not separate things, separable things. And then another American pragmatist who's sort of the patron saint of education per se. By the way, the two guys that were Germans were Lutheran, sort of. The two American guys were Calvinists, sort of. Well, William James's father had gone to Princeton Seminary for a while before he got kicked out, and for being a heretic. And John Dewey grew up as a Calvinist in New England, and left it behind by stages. But I think this is a good thing to bear in mind for thinking about confirmation. If we teach today's students as we taught yesterday's, that is, we keep doing the same old thing, we rob those students of tomorrow. That is, we cannot just keep repeating over and over again. And John Dewey has some pretty important things to say about the brain and learning as well. For anybody who does anything in education, you come back frequently to John Dewey. So there's some background stuff in philosophy, but one of my new favorite books is in paleoanthropology. Michael Tomasello, who is the co-director of the Leipzig Institute for Human Origins, wrote this book published by Harvard University Press last year called The Natural History of Human Thinking. And what he did, among other things, was to compare human beings with our four closest relatives in the great apes: bonobos, chimps, gorillas, and orangutans. Now, they threw gibbons in here just to show you that we're sort of related to them too, but they're monkeys, not apes. But there are 5 living great apes, of which we are one. And so we looked at human children and looked at our cousins to see, what is similar and what's different, and more particularly, what makes human cognition different, and the human brain different than bonobos or gorillas. So one other thing, well, he found, and his research team found, that unlike what the ancient Greeks said, other animals, the great apes, do have reason and even logic, but on a limited basis. But it's not absolute. It used to be for a long time, even up through the Reformation, and until very recently, people would say that the unique thing about human beings as animals is that we have reason. We're the rational animal. But it turns out that's not so unique. Tomasello has demonstrated that what is unique is social cognition. I think this also has implications for how we think about confirmation and methods and how we construct the whole thing. Human beings have evolved to have shared intentionality. More than that, he calls it joint intentionality. Way more than any of our cousins. We can have a sense of we and of doing things for a common purpose. We can even help other people that's not in our own interest. That is altruism. And he has a wonderful way of talking about how the brain has evolved to be a social brain. And the great achievement of humans as great apes, as opposed to all the other ones that are our cousins, is not rationality per se, but it's cooperative endeavors. And to develop, for example, a theory of mind. Like, I can look at you and sort of try to imagine what's going on in your brain while I'm talking, and then try to modulate what I'm saying so that you'll hear it in a certain kind of way. And then he actually says there's another aspect to that, which is we do that not only episodically, but because we have a tremendous capacity for symbolization of experience, we can encode our experience, and then it becomes culture, and we pass it on generationally. The other great apes don't seem to have that ability. So I highly recommend that book. Here's a little schema. It's fairly complicated, actually, the communication theory that goes along with and backs up how it is we have this amazing ability to cooperate thoroughly and deeply and across time. Okay, so in other words, our brains are evolved for social interaction. And more than that, and this comes from Daniel Siegel at UCLA, the brain is actually shaped by social relationships. It's not only Siegel, it's also Vygotsky, the great Russian psychologist who's everywhere now, even though he died in, I think, 1932 or 3, somewhere there. It used to be when you would study developmental psychology, you'd study Piaget and the organic unfolding and development of the body and the mind and all the rest. Vygotsky has a different point of view. As a Marxist, actually it was Karl Marx. One of my graduate students here were reading Karl Marx last week, talking about it. Karl Marx was the one who said that the mind is shaped by the social environment and by the way people interact with each other. And for Marx, it's also about economic conditions. Vygotsky, a few generations later, as a psychologist, actually demonstrated that that's the case, that the mind takes the social environment and introjects it, and the mind is structured on the basis of social relations. So now, when you're reading a textbook, bless you, on educational psychology, you read Piaget and Vygotsky side by side. It is true that there is a natural, organic, genetic determination of certain unfolding. It's also true, though, that the mind, the brain even, is shaped by interactions in the social environment.
Could you briefly differentiate between the mind and the brain?
I will.
Okay,
That's a big thing coming.
thank you.
Okay. Along the way, there have been different ways to think about what is the brain. And there are at least 5 major metaphors. And so the ancient Greek one, and even Luther and Calvin kind of had a version of this. It's the soul and the body. There's the body, and then there's this inner life, which gives us rationality and so on. You see the little guy there inside of the body. Later, during the Industrial Revolution, the idea evolved that the brain is like a machine. It has particular parts that have particular functions, and in fact, some of the brain studies were what happens if you take a piece out, or if somebody gets a big piece of rebar through their brain and they're still alive, but now they can draw a picture of a bird, but they can't name what it is. They have no language for what that is that they just drew. That gave way or led to the idea of the brain as a computer in more recent times, that there's a central processing unit, and then again there are specialized pieces and so on. That has given way to the current metaphor, which is this is a top-down view of the brain, but the brain as a system of networks, just like the internet. There are nodes, but they're interconnected. There's specialized functions, but you can even take a piece out of the brain. You can take out half of the brain, and you can still sort of function. The other side of the brain will compensate for the stuff that was going on in the piece that's now missing, the half that's now missing, which is pretty remarkable. That's one of the reasons why the right brain, left brain stuff and making too much of that is a problem, because there's built-in redundancy. And coming back to plasticity, the brain responds to interaction with the environment and wires and rewires itself all the time. So this is the metaphor that's consistent now, and it's what everybody talks about, is it's a system or multiple systems of networks. So take reading, for example. Reading is a function that is not part of the architecture of the brain naturally. Speech is, and visual capacity is and so on, but reading is too new evolutionarily to be built into the hard wiring of the brain, or the soft wiring, I guess I'd have to say. And so to learn to read is very difficult. It requires using the part of the brain that is focused on symbolization, on sounds, there's a different part on syntax, and there's a certain spatiality. You have to use 3 or 4 main parts of the brain, and they have to integrate in order for you to read. And it's not natural in a sense. A lot of the rest of the human functioning of cognition is natural, but this is not. But the way you can understand how reading functions is a net. You have to establish networks between different regions and functions of the brain in order for it to function. You have a question?
I just have a question about when a person has a stroke, on one side of their brain and affects the other side of the body. So that right brain, left brain thing, how does that relate to that?
You can recover. It depends on how bad the stroke is and where it's. I'm not, a neuroscientist, so I can't go into all the details of that. But it is the case that the brain can compensate and relearn how to speak, even if some area has been effectively knocked out. It is. There may be some possibility for a certain amount of repair in the damaged area, but because that's another thing, is that the brain continues to produce new neurons throughout your whole life. Some thought that you had a certain fixed number of neurons, but that's not the case. The brain continues to produce them. In a little while, we'll see that you have the most neurons from birth through the first year or two of life. And then there's, it's just huge, the number. And then at a certain point in elementary school or just before, it starts to tail off. There's a pruning process that goes on. And that's what makes it possible for, this is also just fascinating to me, a baby could be born anywhere and put anywhere else in the world and acquire the language without accent and the culture and the ways of thinking of people that are different from where they were born, because the brain is this amazingly huge and flexible organ that can adapt to anything in the environment practically, but not forever. It does because the brain is this amazingly huge and flexible organ that can adapt to anything in the environment practically, but not forever. It does begin to kind of get a fix on things. But even when things begin to solidify, the brain is still producing new neurons, and change is possible. It is possible to learn Chinese if you're 55. Something I could look forward to. It wouldn't be as easy as if I was 4 years old, but I could still learn it, and so could you. Okay, well, did I answer your question? Yeah, okay. Okay, I want to show you, this is just a quick, like 4 or 5 minute video on how the brain works at kind of a micro level.
Your brain, the most complex organ in your body, the seat of who we are, what we are, the container for our thoughts and our memories. In short, we are our brains. Our brains are built from many parts that perform different functions. Deep in the centre of the brain is the brainstem. This is the oldest part of the brain, and has also been called the reptilian brain. It controls many essential functions such as breathing and heart rate or blood pressure. It's whether we feel hungry or thirsty. It's also the seat of our most fundamental emotions: happiness or sadness, fear, love or hate. They all seem to reside in the brainstem. Sitting atop the brainstem is the thalamus. This is like an older version of our brain, which now acts as a gateway to the higher cortical regions. All sensory information from our bodies, whether it's sensations from the skin or a sense of touch, passes through the thalamus and is directed to the correct regions of the cortex for further processing. Surrounding the thalamus is a structure called the hippocampus. This is a crucial part of the brain. It's the seat of our spatial working memory. It lets us remember where we put those keys, or how to get back home from work or school. This region has even been shown to be bigger in London counties after doing the knowledge. The folded outer surface of the brain is called the cerebral cortex. Although it all looks the same, it's actually divided into different lobes that perform very different roles. The occipital lobe contains the visual cortex, and so is concerned mainly with vision. The parietal lobe is concerned with processing sensory information and integrating it with the visual information from the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe is the centre for memory and learning. It contains the hippocampus and a number of other regions that are required for us to recognise different objects, faces, sounds and environments. The frontal lobe is probably the most important part of the brain for defining us as who we are. It's where our higher emotions and personality reside, as well as language and social behaviour, lots of things that we think of as being human. It's our decision-making centre. It contains the motor cortex, which controls voluntary movement. At the back of the brain are the two lobes of the cerebellum. This region of the brain is a coordinating centre for movement, allowing us to move multiple sets of muscles in a coordinated fashion so that we
Okay, so that's just a little glimpse at the big picture, but also at the really small level. You can see why, it's really complex, all the chemical and electrical stuff that goes on. And then here's a map showing that, I won't go through all this, but I love this diagram. You get the side view, the cutaway view, top and bottom, the different areas and how they're related. But it's not just like the machine where you have these different areas, it's networks. So these networks are connected to each other, and that's how thinking and learning takes place. Okay, so with some of that just very basic anatomy and physiology in mind, let's talk about what we know about learning. First of all, what Immanuel Kant said, and Hegel, and James, and Dewey, along the way as philosophers, has been borne out by neuroscience. Brains are active, and continuously so, and across the entire life cycle. So that already says something. That in order for learning to take place, learners have to actively construct knowledge. You can't just throw stuff at them and then they absorb it passively and it sticks. They have to actively construct knowledge in order for it to be learned. Okay, now back to brain plasticity. Plasticity has to do with the brain's ability across the life cycle to continually reorganize itself in light of new information and new experience from the environment, and also according to certain sensitivities internally. I mean, just think about that. The brain can rewire itself. I wish Congress could do that. It needs it. But we can do that individually. We can change our minds and reorganize them. This makes it very possible to think about learning for the entire life cycle, and also to unlearn certain things. I was talking with somebody earlier about habits, which are essentially certain networks that have been established and deeply sort of engrooved, but it's possible to establish new patterns, but it takes a long time. And so the existing bad habit, let's say, network, can atrophy over time, and but you can establish new patterns and new habits. In other words, change is possible. It's not easy, and it takes a long time, but partly it's because the brain is plastic and not fixed. Now this, you can't see very well, but you have at least some sense. This is what I was saying about, this is about the number of brain cells, the neurons and so on. And so what you have here, here's birth. And here is 12, the average age, according to some of the data we have, when a lot of confirmation programs take place. Right in here, so this is the first year of life, there are a huge number of neurons that are created. But then, and this is about seeing and hearing, and you got higher cognitive function here and different kinds of functions. So the first few years of life, the first year of life is huge. And then they begin to prune as the brain situates itself in a particular environment, socially and organically. But you see up here, there's two other lines. These are constant production of new neurons having to do with learning, and in the hippocampus and sort of the part that's most responsive to the interaction with the environment. Now, I want to go back. It used to be thought that there were critical periods, and that if you miss education in a certain critical period, it's sort of gone. Language is the key, one of the poster child for Now neuroscientists are talking about sensitive periods. It is true biologically that there are certain timetables, which I just showed you, where things are more plastic and more conducive to certain kinds of brain function and formation. But that does not mean that if you're outside of that window, you can't learn, or that the brain can't reorganize itself along those lines. It just means that it takes more effort and time, probably. Okay, and then for a while in the early part of the last century, probably about through the 60s or 70s, the idea a lot of people thought they were born with a certain intelligence quotient, certain IQ. And it turns out that it's more complicated than that. There is a certain amount of biologically determined capacity, and we have different kinds of capacities, different from each other. But also, it is possible to improve your intelligence. So the language that they use is fixed or general intelligence and fluid intelligence. And some aspects are fixed, but even more parts of intelligence are fluid, partly going back to the plasticity issue. It is possible to change the brain. When you're teaching, you're changing people's brains. You're helping to rewire them because there is this fluid aspect of intelligence. Now, I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about memory. This is the real sort of heart of where neuroscience pays off for thinking about learning and teaching or instruction that promotes learning. Memory is not one thing. It's at least three things neurologically. It's actually each of these big categories you see up there, sensory, short-term, and long-term memory, are actually, you can break those down, and neuroscientists do, into sub-kinds under each category. So there's 15 kinds of memory. But for our purposes as educators, we're going to talk about three. So if you look over here, there's an arrow, and my little slide wasn't big enough to deal with sensory input that comes through our five senses, and even an internal sense, which is almost like a sixth sense, but not from the outside, but we have internal senses. All that data comes first into sensory memory, where it's held for a very short amount of time, a couple of seconds. And in those couple of seconds, basic lower parts of the brain determine what it is and what to do with it, and then send the material or send signals elsewhere. Actually, most of sensory memory just drops out. See the thing down here? Most of that information goes away. This is actually why witnesses in trials are not reliable. They remember certain things, but the full sensory input that they received at the moment, most of it dissipates. But that's true with us too. Actually, you could think about learning not as remembering, but as the gift of forgetting. We want to forget most all the input that comes into us because it's not meaningful. It's not significant. And some of them may not even make sense. We'll see in a little bit that where this sensory data is first processed is in the same area where emotions come from, basic root emotions, which already I want to signal that you cannot separate head and heart in the way that people used to do. Emotionality is a part of cognition. In fact, that an idea arises is suffused with emotionality. It's tagged with significance in various ways. Okay, if sensory input, or if some input makes it beyond sensory memory, the base structures say, hey, this is we have to do something with this. Then it goes into short-term memory, or what's called the workbench memory. That is the place where learning takes place. And so as educators, you want to focus on what goes on in short-term or workbench memory. There, information is held for up to 30 seconds, which is still not very long. And most of what's there also fades or dissipates, doesn't get retained. You can, however, increase the amount of time that something is in workbench memory by what's called rehearsal. If you do something with it while it's on the workbench. If you actively engage it or extend it or question it or play with it, you can keep it in play. Moreover, you can do certain things while it's in that working memory phase, not only to keep it alive, but to make it so that it's likely to go into long-term memory. And isn't that what we're really talking about in education? Is we want to rewire the brain for learners in such a way that they long-term are changed in the way they think and feel and interact with the world. Now, short-term or workbench memory is the bottleneck of the memory system. Think of like an hourglass. It's the neck. It can only handle 5 to 9 items at a time. That's a biological limitation. It's a problem. It's why you can't text and drive. Because you overload working memory and you can't process all of it, and so something you just ignore. It's not even a conscious thing. It's part of the brain's capacities. It's also why the idea of multitasking is actually false. When you're multitasking, you're actually just quickly switching between tasks. You're not doing multiple tasks simultaneously because working memory cannot handle it. It overloads the capacity. But it is possible to fake out the limitation of workbench memory by what's called chunking. Anybody ever heard that? Besides throwing up. Chunking means to take several pieces of data or information and to code them together in an umbrella concept. So, for example, if I used this with the steering committee the other day, but if I say, okay, memorize these numbers, 07041776. And I said, just keep saying that. Rehearse it over in working memory. Presumably you got to working memory. And then, let's say in 5 minutes I ask you, what was that number? So you might be able to remember that. If we were to meet again, let's say on Saturday, and I did a pop quiz, and I said, well, write down that number. You might be able to remember it. But if I asked you in October, what was that number? Probably, chances are you won't remember it. But if I say the date of the Declaration of Independence, you would all know what that is. And I say translate that into numerical form, and anybody could do that as an American. It's very easy because you have taken the Declaration of Independence and you've got several pieces of information coded together around that idea. You've got the date, you've got the location probably, you've got some of the people, you've got the revolution, there's all kinds of stuff. So when you just say Declaration of Independence, that's one bit of information, but it's chunked. Several pieces are added together. Actually, this is the way reading works too, right? First, you have to learn to read by sounding out, remembering the symbol, and what it sounds like. And then you have to start putting those things together and try to remember. But after a while, the brain chunks it so that you don't have to say at. You say that, just as a big chunk of it. Puts all those pieces together. Okay, so this is actually important for thinking about how effective learning works. You want to help learners to chunk information into meaningful, organized clusters of information, not just a whole bunch of data and just, fire those people and stuff. It needs to be organized and it needs to be chunked if it has any hope of going into long-term memory. And just like with keywords in searching, the brain does a coding kind of thing. The more ways that you can do something in working memory with that information that you're trying to help people learn, not only organize it and chunk it, but hopefully have them experience it in different ways and at different times. It'll be multiply coded so that when it will go into long-term memory, and then it can be retrieved more easily if it's got multiple codings and it's part of multiple networks, neuronal networks. So another fact about the way the learning works with regard to the memory system is hard for the brain to cope with. Because the brain is a connection-making, meaning-making organism. So to maximize learning, you have to activate what people already know about a subject, bring it into working memory, and then bring the new stuff and put it together with what is already known. And the brain does all kinds of things with that. Sometimes it makes what is known bigger or whatever. Sometimes it just reframes it. But you don't get very far in terms of learning if you don't activate what people already know. So that is a crucial thing. In other words, don't just start out talking about justification. If they have no way to connect with that, that may be a new chunk of it. That means that you've got to decode it and, in a sense, resolve that into experiences that they have had, that they can connect to or relate to. Maybe they can get to the point where they can exposit what that word means. But if you want that, besides just throwing out stuff for a test, then they forget it and move on. If you want it to be meaningful to them, you have to activate and build bridges to what they already know before you do new stuff with it. Okay. This relates to, there's a difference between surface learning and deep learning. The brain does have capacity to learn things for a particular purpose and limited duration. Surface learning, like cramming for a test, or going to a class where there's lecture. What happens is you can manage that and you can even spit it back, but then it goes away. And a lot of seminary students that I talk to cannot tell me what they actually learned in seminary. I do think they learn some stuff, but 90% of what is encountered in auditory fashion without doing something with it, and without having it in multiple modes, is forgotten. So what we really want is to foster deep learning. And deep learning has, like I said, relating ideas to previous knowledge and experience, bringing stuff up out of long-term memory, putting it in play. And then and the brain is a pattern-seeking instrument. So it has to have some kind of pattern. And then the chunking thing. It also, I'll get to this in a second, but motivation has to be effective. Let me just say another thing about, I already touched on this a little bit, and I won't stop you in a minute so we can talk. But coming back to that, emotions and ideas are connected. And here's why they're connected in a very sort of quick way. Information comes in and is processed in these sort of deeper layers of the brain, coded and then sent to the higher functioning area. So I can't stress this enough. Ideas are never just ideas. They're already suffused with emotional content. So that's one part. The other point is, if we want people to learn, we need to pay attention to the emotional aspect of it, the valence. And that catches out in terms of things like how people feel in the learning environment. If they feel cared for, like what we heard today, if they're seen and known and respected, especially there's all kinds of studies about the influence of teachers on learning. If students feel like teachers know them and love them and care for them, the learning goes way up. If, however, they feel like the teacher is distant from them or somehow hostile to them, this same system is operated, but all the information is coded as threat. And so it shuts down the processes of being open to absorbing the information, and it's all about survival. This is similar to the motivational aspect of learning. It's the same sort of midbrain process that's older than the higher reason aspects of things, processed here, and then different aspects of the brain are involved in motivation. Here's another way to look at it. Here you have the primary processing of information and coding through the amygdala and so on, and then it's sent out to the frontal lobe and the prefrontal cortex and so on. And here you've got different aspects of motivation. Actually, I think neuroscientists have not figured out how motivation works. They're trying to figure it out. It turns out to be very complicated. But for our purposes, people tend to be more motivated to learn if several things that I've just been saying are at play. Number one, you create an environment that's supportive and affirming to the learner. Number two, you activate prior knowledge and bring it into play as a prior condition for new learning. Thirdly, if the new learning is organized and chunked. Fourthly, if that new information is encountered in multiple modes and at different times. I just want to pause here for a second. Sometimes I think we teach confirmation like a series of doctrines. We hit them and move to the next one. And then, we assume that they got it. Actually, I preached for some time in my Christianity classes about this. So in the church, we have no effective way of assessment. We put stuff out there, and my colleagues, most of them at Seminary do this too. They just throw stuff out there, and they assume that people have learned it, then they move on, and it sticks. But they don't actually check to see if it has stuck. And actually, what people know about Jesus and the Bible and all this stuff is way less than what we think. And the reason I know this, and so do you, is you just ask their parents what they know about what it is to be a Christian and the Bible and Jesus, and they know squat, most of them. They hardly know anything. But many of them have gone through church school and confirmation and stuff like that. Okay, so multiple coding, but here's what I'm going on that. Encountering the same knowledge multiple times and at different times is what helps it get cemented. So you can't just throw something out there and then move on and assume they got it. You have to think in terms of a spiral curriculum, where you come back around to the big points multiple times through the process. Here's another way to think about motivation. Here's the brain level, and you see there's multiple sort of dimensions of parts of the brain that are working, and then there's the psychological level, how those brain impulses and so on get translated, and then there's what people actually do with it. I mean, this is only to say motivation is very complex. Well, there's an additional aspect that helps with motivation. If the learner has some agency, some choice. Now, that doesn't mean they have all choice. Like, we're going to let them make up the curriculum. And actually, the statistics we have from the research we've done, most places don't do that. But there has to be some way for the learner to make some choices about what they're encountering. I'll come back to that in a moment. No brain is the same. Even identical twins do not have the same brain wiring. They may be very similar, but because of they negotiate the interface with the environment differently, they also have differences in brain functioning. Here's a map of ways in which learners differ. Brains and their development and their processing differ. There's all kinds of factors. It's not just race, class, and gender. It's also learning style and learning modality and so on. So even kids who are in a confirmation class that are from the same class, economically, they look alike, and so on, they are not going to encounter and learn in the same way. And so effective pedagogy means having learners encounter the core subject matter in different ways. Now, I will say, as soon as I say that, one of the myths about brain and learning is that, okay, people learn differently, so maybe you're an auditory learner, and maybe you're a visual learner, and you're a kinesthetic learner. So what I'm going to do is take the content, Jesus is Lord or something, and I'm going to give it to you in auditory stuff, maybe we'll play some Bach or something, and I'll give it to you with charts, and you have to, enact the story. And that will help you learn. There is not a shred of evidence that that's effective. Matching learning styles and pedagogy kind of one for one. What is effective is realizing people differ, taking the subject matter, and have all three of you encounter that subject matter, but in multiple ways. That kind of works for you, because each one of you has all three of those modes. It's just that it's a little bit stronger, a little bit weaker. But the idea is don't be a one-trick pony when you're teaching. Have multiple ways to come up with encounter for learners, because they differ. I already talked about creating a positive environment, and what happens when the brain feels like it's under threat. One of the reasons why agency is important in learning is because that's in the front part of the brain where executive function is and metacognition goes on. And learners tend to learn more and remember more when they have some active say in the process. They're not just victims of learning or teaching. Okay, a few things in particular about adolescent brains, and then I'll just stop. somebody brought this up, but the executive function in the front part of the brain doesn't fully mature until 24 or 25 years of age. It starts at around 12, and it takes 12 years, so half of a person's life when they're 24 has been spent developing the higher region and the executive control function of the brain. At 12, it's just barely getting going. Here's some neuroimaging to make that point. This is the region right here, which has to do with executive functions. Okay, you see down here, the red and yellow means less fully mature, purplish means mature and stable. So here you have the 5-year-old brain, the preteen brain, so 10, 11 years old. There's some progress and movement there. This is the teenage brain where it's in process in a really big way. And then at 20 years old, it's mainly developed. So, Daniel Siegel, in his book Brainstorm, which I highly recommend about the teenage brain, points out that there's a temporary disjunction between the development trajectory of the emotional system of the brain and the executive function system of the brain during the teenage years. They're not lined up and they're not integrated fully. That's why you get risky behavior and all kinds of acting out and so on. And we just need to take that into account. And Siegel talks about needing to create a supportive environment where we understand what's going on and to support and encourage the development of executive function, which helps to make better choices about impulse control. One thing I haven't talked about is learning takes place, is consolidated at night during REM sleep. Teenagers need an extra hour of sleep on average than children and adults. 8 to 9 hours. They need 9 hours. Most of us are supposed to need 8 on average. So here's what happens in sleep. There are cycles, and this is not probably new information, but it may be new that where memories are filed and where they move into and are cemented in long-term memory is during REM sleep. So there's, on average, 5 of those cycles per night. If you only get 6 hours of sleep a night, you've lost 2 of those REM cycles where learning takes place. Now, the solidification of learning and the memory, moving into long-term memory.